Okay, so in this video, let's talk first about the long run aggregate supply. If you remember, in the last video I told you there's a difference between the short run and the long run aggregate supply. The short run is a time when at least one factor of production is fixed. The long run is a time when all factors of production are variable, right? So if I draw the picture of the macroeconomy another time where I have the real GDP on the x-axis and the price index on the y-axis, then the long run aggregate supply is basically a vertical line. That's your LRAS. That means the economy has reached a real GDP when no matter what happens to the price index in the economy, there is no increase or decrease in the real GDP. The real GDP stays the same. That means the economy has kind of reached its full potential. There is no scope for the economy to increase the real GDP any further, right? So this real GDP corresponding to the long run aggregate supply, this is also known as potential real GDP. If you remember, GDP was denoted by capital Y in your module 3. So that's why I'm calling it Y potential. Simply it is also called YP. So that's your potential real GDP. That means your country has reached the potential. Now another objective of the long run aggregate supply or YP is that it basically gives you the target for the economy. So this is where your economy eventually wants to go. So it's like a goal for the economy, it's like a target for the economy. This is where the economy eventually wants to get to, or this is the stable state for the economy. This is the stable state for the economy, and it's a stable state because this real GDP is also the full employment real GDP. The full employment real GDP. What do I mean by that? This word full employment basically means there is zero unemployment in the economy. There is no unemployment in the economy, which means everyone who is willing and able to work has a job. Please note, full employment means all factors of production are optimally used. There is no overutilization or underutilization of any resource. And everybody who is willing and able to work has a job. There is zero unemployment in the economy. So you can understand this is a very hypothetical situation in the real world. In the real world, this is a hard to find. This situation will be very hard to achieve. However, the objective of every economy is to get to that point. The target of every economy is to get to that point. Okay. Now that is about the long run aggregate supply. Now if I draw the economy, the diagram for the macroeconomy, let me kind of wipe this out quickly. We want to draw the diagram for the macroeconomy. So in the macroeconomy, this is what my diagram will look like. So I have my real GDP on the x-axis, my price index on the y-axis, reminding you this is not a dollar value. This is your objective of the economy, so that's your long run aggregate supply, and that's your potential real GDP YP. Now in reality, in this current accounting period, in the short run, there are two possibilities for your economy. Your economy could lie on the left hand side of the long run aggregate supply. That means you could have your aggregate demand curve like that, your downward sloping AD curve, and you have your upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve like SRAS1. Let's call that SRAS1, let's call this AD1. This is a possibility for the economy. It could be lying on the left. That means the country is falling short of its target. In other words, your actual real GDP is Y1, where your Y1 is less than your potential. Okay, so you have an actual real GDP of the economy which is less than the potential real GDP. You could have a situation like that, or you could theoretically have a situation where your aggregate demand is something like 82 and your actual short run aggregate supply is something like SRAS2, and you have an actual real GDP in the economy which looks like Y2. And please note that here the actual real GDP is higher than the potential, isn't it? And I will tell you what these things mean, what the two things mean. But before that, please understand that this is the objective of the economy. This is the stable state for the economy. This is where the economy wants to be. But in reality, in the current accounting period, actually your economy either could be on the left or could be on the right of this vertical line of the long run aggregate supply curve. If your economy is on the left, then you have a situation where your actual real GDP, let's call that actual real GDP, if your actual RGDP is less than your potential RGDP, so your Y1 is less than your YP, this basically means that there is an output gap. What do I mean by output gap? That means there is a difference. This is what I mean by the output gap. This is the output gap I'm talking about. And there is an output gap such that your actual is less than your potential. So your country is underperforming than its potential. There is underutilization of resources, which basically means there is unemployment in the economy. There is positive level of unemployment. The unemployment rate in the economy is greater than 0. There is unemployment existent in the economy. And this kind of output gap that you see here, when your actual real GDP is less than the potential, this kind of output gap, very important, is known as recessionary gap. So whenever your economy is on the left hand side of the long run aggregate supply curve, such that the actual real GDP is less than the potential real GDP, it means that there is an output gap in the economy such that there is unemployment in the economy, and that kind of an output gap is called the recessionary gap. Okay. Now similarly, if the country was in a point like this, right, if it was here, let's name these points. Let's call this A, let's call this B. So this is at A, right? Now at B, you have a situation where your actual real GDP is greater than the potential real GDP. That's also a theoretical possibility, right? So your Y2 is greater than your YP. Once again, you still have an output gap. That means there is still a difference between the actual and the potential. Your country is not at its potential. Instead, there is an output gap where there is overutilization of resources in the country, and that overutilization of resources basically leads to a negative unemployment rate. Now that is something you do not see in the real world, but that's a theoretical possibility. It's possible theoretically, because it simply means that people not only have one job, but they have multiple jobs available to them. They have multiple jobs available to them. Okay, that is what we mean. Now even then there is an output gap, and that kind of an output gap is known as the inflationary gap. The inflationary gap. Okay. So that means whenever your economy is on the right hand side of the long run aggregate supply, such that your actual real GDP is greater than the potential, then you have an output gap which is called the inflationary gap, and at that inflationary gap there is a negative unemployment rate. So there is no unemployment in the country, right? There is negative unemployment, which means it is more than full employment. People not only have one job, but they have multiple jobs available to them. Now before we move forward, please understand that these points A and B are basically the short run equilibrium. I'm going to call them SRE. These are short run equilibria because these are the intersection points of AD curve with a short run aggregate supply curve. They do not lie on the long run aggregate supply. So these are just temporary unstable points for the economy. These are both unstable points. That means the economy does not want to be here forever. The economy wants to move to a stable point. So if the economy is at a point like A or it is at a point like B, the ultimate objective of the economy is to move towards this vertical line. So if the economy is at A, it would want to move in that direction, and if the economy is at B, it would want to move in the opposite direction. Okay, and how will it move? It will move through the shifts of the aggregate demand and the short run aggregate supply curve. That means it has to move through a positive or a negative demand or supply shock. If you do not remember what these things mean, then please go back to the previous videos and take a look at it. Okay, but the ultimate objective for any economy is to move from this short run equilibrium towards its long run equilibrium. In other words, the objective of the economy is to wipe out any kind of inflationary or recessionary gap. So the ultimate objective of the economy is to come to a point like this, where you have intersection, let's call it point C, where you have intersection of an AD curve, let's call that AD3, one SRAS curve, SRAS3, and also it lies on the long run aggregate supply. So C is a long run equilibrium, okay, because it lies on the vertical line. So the objective of the economy is to go from points like A or B to a point like C, and that will happen through the shifts of this curve. For example, if your economy is at point A, then either the AD curve needs to go right or the SRAS curve needs to go right, because your economy has to move that way. Okay, so if your economy has to move from point A to point C, then either your AD curve has to go rightward or your SRAS curve has to go rightward. Please understand this carefully. This is an important part. Okay, so if your economy is at point A, you have a recessionary gap, then to remove that gap, your economy has to move here. It has to go rightward, and to go rightward to a point like C, your economy can do that by either shifting the AD curve to the right from AD1 to AD3, or by shifting the SRAS curve to the right from SRAS1 to SRAS3, right? So that means we can say that in this situation, if there is a recessionary gap, then your economy needs a positive shock, either a positive demand shock or a positive supply shock. That is necessary for the economy to go from a short run equilibrium to a long run equilibrium when there is a recessionary gap. So a recessionary gap can be removed by a positive shock, either supply or demand. Okay. Similarly, if the economy was at a point like B, then that gap, the inflationary gap, could be removed by shifting the economy leftward, right, going from here to there. And as that happens, that gap, the inflationary gap, this gap would get removed because your economy would go in that direction. So it would come here, isn't it? You can see at point C, your real GDP is actually at the potential. So that means if your economy moves from B to C, your real GDP goes from Y2 to YP and the gap is removed. So that can happen, that leftward movement can happen only if the AD curve goes left or if the SRAS curve goes left. Please note, if the AD curve goes left from AD2 to AD3 or the SRAS curve goes left from SRAS2 to SRAS3, right? So we can say that if there is an inflationary gap in the economy, then that gap can be removed by a leftward shift of the AD or the SRAS curve, which is basically a negative shock. Please go back to the previous videos and make sure you understand a positive and a negative shock. I'm referring to a right shift of AD or SRAS. Here I'm referring to a left shift of AD or SRAS. Okay, so this is what we have here. Now, before I end the chapter, in the next video, I'm going to talk to you about a little bit about the positive and the negative supply shocks, and I will also talk to you about the adjustment process of the economy from the short run to the long run equilibrium. That is what I'm going to do. in the next video, and that will end module 4 unit 1 for us.